In this video, we're going to be talking about the article, The Role of Trust in Knowledge. It is assumed by many philosophers and epistemologists in particular that evidence is paramount or necessary in knowledge and not trust. In fact, trust seems to be antithetical to evidence, right? Because trust seems to entail that you don't have the evidence sufficient to hold a particular belief as true. But in fact, what Hartwig wants to argue is not just that knowledge seems to require, or not just that a lot of our knowledge is based on trust, but that a lot of times knowledge seems to require trust, that we cannot have knowledge without trust. So that is a stronger claim, and it's a very contentious claim to make. So here's the position that Hartwig wants to defend, that knowledge, at least in the modern sense, like a lot of the stuff that we know now in the 21st century, cannot be known independently from anything else. Like, in other words, we can't just come to know this stuff just within our own right. It's not self-reliant. In fact, modern knowledge about ourselves and about the world, seems to require the trustworthiness of members of this epistemic community, right? And we're all kind of working together in this joint enterprise to come to justify certain knowledges. So the way that Hartwig wants to go about arguing for this position is to show that this is already the case within the sciences and within mathematics, right? So the scientific community, the mathematical community, both of these communities that are very well respected, that we usually take, as obviously true, anything that they say, these communities already depend a lot on mutual trust that they have within members of their own community. So if it can be proven or shown that the knowledge that we acquire from the sciences, the knowledge that we acquire from mathematicians, if those knowledge claims are based on trust, then obviously this is going to be the spill over into other parts of society at large. There is other knowledge that we claim to have is also going to be based on trust. So let's start with science. What's the evidence that scientific knowledge depends on trust? Well, we don't need to look far. We just need to look at scientific journals and how it is that they come to be justified. So the process of gathering and analyzing data, it takes a long time. It's a very arduous process and endeavor, and it takes many individuals in order to do this. There is no one individual within any discipline, scientific discipline, that just knows enough to be able to conduct the necessary experiments to corroborate the hypotheses that are set forth, right? Not just conducting the experiments, but again, then trying to analyze the results of those experiences to ultimately come to some kind of scientific consensus where we could say, okay, now this is known scientifically, right? Any claim that is taken to be true within any of the sciences is always going to be the effort of a community of scientists working perhaps independently, but also with one another in order to establish set truth. And the same is the case for even more abstract disciplines such as mathematics, right? So mathematical proofs, for example, are things that sometimes take many individuals and take long periods of time to prove. So one famous example is the Weyl conjecture. This took decades and took many individuals to try to prove it over a long period of time. And now that it's proven, we take it as, okay, whenever something is proven in mathematics, we know that it's true, but it required a lot of background results, a lot of background information that was, in some sense, quote unquote, taken for granted or taken at face value, or it was at trust, in order to implement into this overall arching proof to show that this conjecture is in fact true. So the following thesis seems to be correct. This is the thesis that Hartwig calls T prime. If a knower A knows that B knows P, a proposition P, then we can say that A knows P, right? So in this case, B is supposed to be an individual of some kind with some kind of expertise or specialization within a subject matter. So that when we say that B knows P, a proposition, B knows that whatever that proposition is, we are assuming that B has good reasons, good justification for knowing P, and in addition to that, that P is true. So what the clause is saying is that, look, if an individual, any person, any layperson knows that this expert knows P, then it has to be the case that that individual A also knows P in virtue of the testimony, if you will, of B, of the expert, right? So one thing that is suggested by this thesis is that the testimony that B gives to A can't be, or the reasons for why B knows that P are, that is only going to be useful to A under the conditions that A doesn't already have that information. Because if A already had that information, then B's testimony about the truthfulness of P wouldn't make sense, right? So this really encapsulates this kind of trust component that Harwich wants to argue for, and for which he thinks that thesis T prime is capturing, right? The fact that, look, here you have an individual, B, this expert in this field, and they have all the reasons to believe that or know that P is true, and they are, if you will, passing on those reasons to A via testimony, and in virtue of A trusting B, then A can come to know that P is true. Now, Harwich wants to drive the point that T prime has to be true. And the way that he goes about doing it is the following. He says, look, if it turns out that T prime is not true, then here's some of the things that follow. Here's some of the things that we would be committed to. First off, there would no longer be any scientific knowledge. We can no longer be knowledgeable in any scientific discipline. Because, as we kind of already hinted or maybe demonstrated, scientific knowledge requires a lot of trust. There's no one individual that can conduct all the experiments, gather all of the data, analyze all the data, in order to finally corroborate the belief in a particular scientific proposition. This is a joint enterprise by a lot of members in the scientific community. So if it's not the case that T prime is true, then scientific knowledge doesn't seem possible or feasible. But of course we think that scientific knowledge is possible or feasible. No one denies that. Furthermore, if T prime were not to be true, then what we are saying is that we would have to ignore most, or if not some of the best evidence that we have for a lot of these scientific propositions, namely whatever the scientists tell us. The reason most of us know anything about the world around us, anything about the physical world around us, for instance, we all know that our cells our bodies are composed of cells, and that our cells are composed of molecules, that our molecules are composed of atoms, and so on and so forth. The reason most of us know this, and we actually do know this, it's not because we've actually, say, looked into a microscope or conducted the experiments or anything of that nature. It's because we essentially trusted our science teachers, who perhaps trusted their science instructors, and so on. We trust the scientific community in general, right? We think that they have the best evidence for the, say, the belief or for the proposition that the human body is composed of cells, let's just say, right? So to say that T prime isn't true would suggest that, we would have to ignore all of this evidence, because again, all of this evidence is, we're just taking it on trust, essentially. The last reason why T prime has to be true is because otherwise we would be committed to the idea that individuals wouldn't be able to know anything. Only communities would be able to know stuff. But it's clear that us as individuals do know things, right? Especially we do have scientific knowledge. So the scientific community has knowledge, but also us as individual members of society have the individual knowledge that the scientific community gives us. Well, how can this be the case if, again, we're not the ones that are collecting the data, doing the observations, the experiments, and so on and so forth? Well, it's because that knowledge, that information is transferred to us via the testimony of the scientific community, and we primarily take it at face value, or it's because we trust the scientific community. So again, all of this seems to suggest, according to Harwich, that T prime is in fact the case, or it's in fact accurate or true, right? That there is knowledge that we come to know only in virtue of trusting the experts who know whatever that proposition may be, the proposition in question. So one final thing to note that Harwick tries to highlight is the fact that it's not just about what A, as the layperson, knows, right? This kind of individual that's roaming around society and trusting the experts, say B, but it also has to do with B, the knowledge giver, if you will, the expert in the scientific community, right? Who's also just in their own right, also trusting their fellow scientists and so on. It's also the case that B's reliability of character is important in how much we know, right? B's trustfulness, their competence in the scientific work, their epistemic character, all of this plays a role in our knowledge. So it's not just that, we're taking B almost at, let's just say, at face value. I mean, we do take it at face value, but the knowledge that is transmitted to us from, say, the scientific community via testimony is only going to be as good as the reliability of the character of the scientist within the scientific community, right? So they have to be reliable in what it is that they are espousing, what it is that they are asserting as a community, in order for us, the lay people, to not just trust them, but in trusting them, also acquiring the knowledge that they are providing us with. So this highlights another feature of what Harwick is trying to argue for, that perhaps it's already encompassed within the main claim, but it just kind of highlights how contentious what he is saying is, that a lot of our knowledge, right, if everything he's saying is correct, that a lot of our knowledge not only doesn't depend on our own individual works, right? It depends on the trust that we give to others, but a lot of our knowledge is really just out of our control. It's out of our hand. So in some sense, we play a very minimal role in our overarching knowledge, say, of the world, insofar as our knowledge of the world depends on the work and testimony of others, like those individuals in the scientific community. Okay, so that concludes this video.